Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about the madness of our modern world. We live in a world that is changing. It is becoming more conservative. People have noticed that. And this is due in large part to the madness of progressivism. A madness that most people don't really trace back to its source. Some people do. Some people at least try to. But we don't go back enough, I don't think. And it ties into my central thesis that everyone is religious. This includes atheists. Most of the time when I say that, I am grossly misunderstood. So, to be very clear, I'm not saying atheism is a religion. It, of course, doesn't matter that I just said I'm not calling atheism a religion, because militant atheists who listen to this video will already know that I just said atheism is a religion. Then I denied calling atheism a religion. But I really didn't. I said everyone is religious, including atheists. I did not say atheism is a religion. Atheism is often framed as the opposite of religion, and if someone's an atheist, we say they're not religious in our modern world. It's like if someone were to ask, if they met someone, do you know what religion he is? And he says, oh, he's not religious, he's an atheist. And we take that to mean that someone is not religious by definition if they're an atheist. The problem with this is that by so doing, we equate religion with theism. We're effectively saying belief in a god is the same thing as religion. But no one ever limits religion to just belief that a god exists. Many of the things that atheists complain about in religion, for instance, such as how religion creates tribalism and an in-group, out-group preference, and that there are doctrines and dogmas that may not be questioned, that it stifles free thought and free inquiry, and how religion promotes conformity to a set of ideals, and so on. All of those criticisms can be found in secular alternatives to religion, such as secular humanism, a non-religious life stance. And yet we see them as criticisms of religion, as if things that are not religious don't have this, or at least have it to a much smaller degree, that it is a fundamental nature to religion to have certain things. But that's the point. If religion is just believing a god exists, or believing in a god or gods, and believing in the supernatural, then religion really isn't about conformity. It really isn't about tribalism. It really isn't about in-group, out-group preference. You can't really have a group based on just believing a god exists. The same thing exists when people talk about religion. And they'll say things like, religion says that being gay is a sin. No, it doesn't. Not if religion is just believing a god exists. Religion doesn't teach that homosexuality is a sin, because you can believe a god exists and think homosexuality is not a sin. You can believe a god exists and believe in a woman's right to reproductive freedom. With apologies for certain exaggerations, if this is the first video of mine you've seen, I am under heavy restrictions from our dear host, so I have to speak in an unusual way to bypass Al Gore and his rhythm, if you know what I mean. But having said that, you can believe a god exists and believe the Bible is a book of fairy tales written by Bronze Age goat herders. You can believe a god exists and not believe that Jesus died on the cross for you. And yet we hear people talk about religion demanding you believe all of those things. It's obvious that in our modern world we conflate the word religion with Christianity, and we conflate them both with theism, but they're not all the same thing. And one of the main problems that I have in the modern world is how we dump everything together into easily digestible categories when they're not really those categories, and we don't look at the history of the concepts themselves. But therein lies the point. You see, I take a functionalist view of religion because I believe that is a more accurate way of understanding the situation. And in a functionalist view of religion, religion is understood based upon what it does, rather than being understood in the context of trying to find certain traits that all religions share. I do believe there are certain traits that all religions share, but the traits are not something that we would think of as religious in our modern world, because I do understand religion to be primarily a study of human psychology. That is not to say that I think all religious concepts are purely psychological constructs. I do believe that religions speak about the real world we live in. But I don't really think it's possible to be non-religious. And there's two reasons I believe that. The first is I don't really think atheists exist. I honestly think we are all born with an instinctual knowledge of God, which, of course, contradicts the modern militant atheist dogma that we are all born atheists and only believe in God because we were indoctrinated as children to believe in religion. But there's plenty of scientific study that show that humanity is inclined to believe in a God or a higher power of some sort. And I shan't go into detail in this video about that. I'll do another video in the future about it. But for right now, we really don't have any reason to think we're all born believing there is no God. And by the way, if you're an atheist listening to this, I know I just misdefined atheism, and atheism is not a belief there is no God, it's a lack of belief in a God, but you have to understand that I'm going by the real world and not by the delusional fantasies of modern atheism. Atheism is a belief that there is no God, and atheists claim there is no God every time they call someone delusional for believing in a magical sky wizard, or calling God people's imaginary friend, and saying that God doesn't exist and is a fictional character in a badly written fantasy novel written by Bronze Age goat herders. The idea that atheism is a lack of belief in a God comes in handy when you're saying that you have no burden of proof, but it's cowardly and it's dishonest, and I'm not going to play that game. But having said that, I really don't think anyone is an atheist. The people who are most insistent that they merely lack belief in a God due to insufficient evidence, they all are so angry at God, and their anger toward God is obvious, and their hatred of God is obvious. And they'll often ask the question, how can I hate something I don't believe in? And I can ask the same question. How can you hate something that you don't believe in? Because their hatred is obvious. I don't believe them when they say they lack belief. But it really doesn't matter, because there is a second reason I would say atheists are religious, and this second reason accepts that atheists don't believe in God. You see, I don't think that you have to believe in a God in order to be religious, that you can hold an entirely atheistic religion. This may sound radical, but keep in mind that the new atheists have been saying the same thing for years. They just didn't admit it. And the modern atheist community still repeats the lines from the new atheism while telling us the new atheism is irrelevant and we've moved on, even though we clearly haven't. You see, one of the problems that atheism has had since the Cold War, and especially since around 1989 with the fall of communism, is that communism lost the Cold War, and it lost all cultural credibility, at least until the early 2000s or the 2020s, when woke activists started reviving communism en masse. But largely people didn't like communism. And they pointed out how communist regimes were violent and brutal and repressive, and how they stripped people of their freedoms and their dignities. And Marxism is an inherently atheistic philosophical view. And all of the Marxist countries embraced state atheism and promoted atheism and discouraged religion, using their and the world's terms, not my own. Well, the atheist movement, especially with the new atheism, sought to distance itself from the atrocities of communism, and they did so by claiming that the communists did not kill in the name of atheism, they killed in the name of communism, in an argument that is itself disingenuous, because you could make exactly the same argument for theism. Of course, when you do, you get the same litany of atrocities committed by religious people in the name of religion, because they're equating religion with theism, and they don't really seem to understand the point that I'm making. For instance, they'll say, if I tell them that no one has ever killed in the name of theism, they'll say, oh, what about the Crusades? What about the Inquisition? What about 9/11? And they could list other atrocities. And they'll often include atrocities that actually didn't have anything to do with religion, at least the way we traditionally define it, like the Holocaust, or the removal of Native Americans from American lands, or things like that. But they don't really seem to understand the point. When they say no one has ever killed in the name of atheism, what they're arguing is that even if someone kills in the name of a philosophy that is inherently atheistic, they are not primarily motivated to kill just because they lack belief in a God due to insufficient evidence, but are killing in the name of spreading that ideology which goes well beyond atheism. But they don't use the same logic with theism. You're killing in the name of believing a God exists if you kill in the name of believing a God exists plus other things, such as plus believing that Jesus was the Savior, plus believing that people must believe in Jesus to be saved, plus believing that it is morally wrong to reject Christ. That's killing in the name of belief in a God, but it's not. Because when I argue that no one has ever killed in the name of theism, I'm making exactly the same argument they do with atheism. Meaning you can't include belief that the Bible is the Word of God, that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus died for you. None of that has anything to do with believing a God exists. Or rather, it does, but you can believe a God exists without that. The Crusades, for example, were not fought in the name of believing a God exists with no other beliefs added. The fact that atheists know this because they keep pointing to it as an atrocity that Christians committed, not theists, specifically Christians. And in the mythology of the holy religion of atheism, they keep telling us that the Crusaders went down to invade and colonize native brown people land because they were Muslim and they thought they had the wrong religion. So they just went down there to kill Muslims because they didn't think they worshipped the right God and didn't think they had the right religion. This isn't really the history of the Crusades, but it is the history of the Crusades you got around the time of the New Atheism, that the Christians just invaded Muslim lands because they didn't like the Muslims having the wrong religion and that they worshipped the wrong God. But the thing is, even accepting that simplistic and not accurate narrative about the Crusades, you are still stuck with the fact that they were invading and killing Muslims in their own land because they were Christian, not because they were theist. And while you have to be a theist to be a Christian, you can be a theist without being a Christian. And in order to kill in the name of theism, you have to kill only in the name of believing a God exists with nothing else added. The same is true of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was held to root out Christian heresies amongst Christians. And apparently other groups, because people like Sam Harris said that the Jews were seen as the worst species of heretic by Christians. This, of course, is nonsense. The Jews were never understood as heretics within Christianity, because to be a heretic means to profess belief in the Christian faith whilst holding heterodox views. It is literally impossible for a Jew to be a heretic in the context of Christianity. Just like it's literally impossible for a Muslim to be a heretic, or a Buddhist. To be a heretic, you have to be someone who claims to be a Christian who holds to heterodox beliefs instead of orthodox beliefs. That's why traditional Catholics will persist in calling Protestants heretics. But you don't really hear them talking about Jews as heretics, and you really don't find that historically either. Now, I think this particular myth within atheism came from the conversios in Spain, where after the Reconquista, the Christian kingdoms banned both Muslims and Jews, or really anyone who wasn't a Christian, from Hispania. They banned them from the Iberia Peninsula. In order to remain in Iberia, Jews would often convert to Christianity. And some of the conversios were sincere in their conversion, or became sincere later, but others weren't. Others just converted so they could stay. And there was always mistrust in the conversios, that they were secretly still practicing Judaism. And in some cases they were right. And no, I'm not saying this made it right. I know atheists love saying, oh, so that makes it okay, sarcastically. I'm just talking about history. I'm not saying it makes it okay. I'm just talking about facts. But some Jews really did fake conversion whilst continuing to practice Judaism. And others were sincere in their conversion, but were still placed under suspicion. And I think that's where Sam Harris got the idea that the Jews were seen as the worst species of heretic during the Dark Ages, even though the Reconquista was more early modern than medieval and really didn't last that long in terms of history. Sam Harris probably just heard that factoid and applied it to the entire Dark Ages and assumed it was about all Jews. But I don't really know that for sure. That's just speculation. But the point being made is that it doesn't matter, because even accepting the historical narratives of the atheist movement, no Christian action they can point to, or for that matter, no Muslim action or action from any other religion, can be traced back to just believing a God exists, with no other additional beliefs. And that's why the argument that no one has ever killed in the name of atheism is dishonest. Because if you point to an atheist movement that killed people specifically to spread an atheistic ideology, they'll point to the rest of the ideology and say, see, it wasn't atheism, it was all this other stuff. But when it comes to theism, they'll say, belief in a God has caused violence, look at this violent act. And they'll ignore the fact that the act is more than just belief in a God. In fact, they'll say, well, it may have gone beyond just belief in a God. But without belief in a God, those other beliefs wouldn't have happened. And it's rather disingenuous, because without belief that no God exists and that we live in a material world, the rest of communism wouldn't have happened either. And as much as they say atheism is not a belief there is no God, it's a lack of belief in a God, the fact of the matter is that even modern atheists adhere to materialism and deny the supernatural exists. And it's just fraudulent to say they just lack belief. And ultimately, killing in the name of an atheist ideology is killing in the name of atheism. Because if that ideology spreads, atheism will also spread. Killing in the name of Marxism is killing in the name of atheism. Even if not all atheists are Marxists, all Marxists, if they truly follow Marxist principles, are atheists. And you really can't spread Marxism without spreading atheism. Atheism is the overarching belief that is at the core of Marxism. But what makes it interesting is that the way the new atheists distanced themselves from Marxism was by capitalizing on the distinction that we make as a culture between atheism and religion, viewing atheism as the opposite of religion. They then claimed that Marxism is a religion, that communism is a religion. After all, as Sam Harris said, they may have killed for their beliefs, but their beliefs weren't particularly rational. By so doing, they equate being an atheist with being rational, which Sam Harris also explicitly states. He said that atheism is just the noises rational people make in the face of irrational belief. To Sam Harris, being an atheist and being a rational person are the same thing. The communists were not rational, therefore they were not atheists, therefore they were religious. Now, keep in mind, Sam Harris and the other atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, who argue that Marxism is actually a form of religion and we should blame religion on their atrocities, also insist that we understand atheism as being all about believing in a god and a supernatural realm, which very clearly the communists didn't believe in. So they're not actually being very consistent in how they define religion and how they understand it. Because on the one hand, in order to be religious, you have to believe in a god and believe in the supernatural. And on the other hand, certain atheists who denied the existence of God and denied the supernatural were religious. This is inconsistent, it's incoherent, it doesn't make any sense, but for some reason they became best-selling authors. And people still operate under this weird system to this day. But you'll notice weird things like that if you read atheist literature and really think about it instead of going, hell yeah, and just buying into it. Tim Whitmarsh and A.C. Grayling do the same thing when they argue that religion was not the default for humanity and there have been non-religious societies, and they point to ancient Greece and ancient Rome as non-religious. Because both ancient Greece and ancient Rome worshipped a variety of gods. But according to Tim Whitmarsh, they were not religious because they didn't have a central holy book or organized clergy. But then again, he also says in the same book that Plato vacillated between Socrates and his atheistic teachings and religion, but at the end chose religion, with his justification for saying Plato chose religion over Socrates, and Socrates' view of the world being that Plato believed in a god. Plato, after all, didn't choose belief in a single holy book and organized clergy. He chose belief in a god. So Plato chose religion and rejected Socrates' atheistic view of the world because he chose to believe a God exists, whilst other people who chose to believe a God exists are not religious because they don't have a holy book and don't have clergy. This is incoherent. And it's always been incoherent. It's never made sense. But it has the aura of making sense. It has the aura of sounding rational, in part due to some background myths that we've accepted, such as the idea that science and religion are at war with each other, a 19th century idea created by Draper and White that's been discredited since the 1950s, but that atheists insist hasn't, and it's just a fact. Or the idea of equating atheism with rationality and religion with irrationality, or defining faith as belief without evidence, and even using the Bible to claim it proves that by pointing to Hebrews 11:1, which never actually says faith is belief without evidence, but they take it to mean that. And therein lies the point. You see, I would contend that most, not all, but most, modern atheists, especially those who go on about how evil and irrational religion is, are actually quoting religious mythology when they say this. The religious mythology that they're quoting, though, is a mythology that comes out of the modern-day atheist movement. Because no one is ever just an atheist. People always have belief systems that correlate with their atheism. And again, atheism itself is a belief. Even the idea that atheism is not a belief, but a lack of belief, and specifically that atheists do not believe there is no God, they lack belief in a God, is an idea. As paradoxical as that may sound, saying it, it makes sense if you think about it. Understanding atheism as a lack of belief in a God is an idea about what atheism is. It's a false idea, but it's nevertheless an idea of what atheism is. And the conceptualization of an atheist as rational and logical and clear thinking, and as one that believes in using reason and logic and evidence to come to their conclusions and who engages in critical thinking, in contrast to a religious person who bases all their beliefs on faith, which by definition is irrational because faith is defined as belief without evidence, and how religious people think more with their emotions and what feels right, any emotional validation, and that they're just indoctrinated as children to believe, and they wouldn't believe otherwise because they're born atheists, and how religious people are hypocritical because they believe in their religion without questioning it, while realizing the absurdity of the claims of other religions. And if they could just take the outsider's test of faith, they would realize it. All of that is ultimately irrational, but it is nevertheless believed in by a large body of the atheist community. And we've all heard this before, and it's fairly obvious at this point, with atheists running atheist organizations and having popular atheists on social media promoting atheism and atheistic ideas and atheist thoughts, and people talking about secular values, that they don't really just lack belief. And ultimately, this affects other aspects of them. For example, it's rather popular to hear atheists talk about how religious people are overwhelmingly conservative. And this is because they follow religious teachings and a holy book that are static and unchanging, that promote a specific conservative view, which is why the overwhelming majority of religious people are conservative, whilst atheists are unpredictable politically because they're all over the place on the political map. Atheists could be either liberal or conservative. They could be the most progressive people out there or the most traditional, because atheism as a lack of belief in a God is not a coherent belief system or philosophy, and allows people to be anything politically so long as they lack belief in a God. And based on that definition of atheism, they know that atheists are much more politically diverse than religious people are. The only problem is that this isn't reality. In reality, the vast, overwhelming majority of atheists are progressives. This is probably changing in the modern world, but if you look at between the time when the new atheism got started in 2006 onward, the majority of atheists, especially those that endlessly go on talking about how religion is evil and irrational and must be done away with, religion must die for humankind to live, those sorts of atheists are always left-wing in their thinking. In fact, even accepting that we have religious people on one hand and atheists on the other, with atheism as the opposite of religion. Religious people tend to be more politically diverse than atheists. Something like around, depending on what source you use, Pew, the U.S. Census Bureau, Statistica, whatever you're using. It doesn't uniformly agree, and I don't have internet access right now to check figures, but it's around 90% of atheists are left-wing politically. And in America, around that percent also vote Democrat and support left-wing causes. Around 90%. Meanwhile, when it comes to religious people in general, which is one thing I really hate, is how they just lump all religious people together in one category called religious people as opposed to non-religious. But the number is closer to 50-50, where around 50% of them are Republican and around 50% are Democrat. And even when you break it down by religion and just look at Christians, it's not like the vast overwhelming majority of Christians are Republican. There might be a slight lead to Republicans, but it's nothing like 90%. It's more like around 55 to 60% are Republican to 45 to 40% are Democrat, something like that. And even when you look at the churches individually, the ones that we consider the conservative churches, like evangelicals, yeah, they're overwhelmingly Republican, but not to the same degree that atheists are with being Democrats and being progressive. Something like 60 to 75%, depending on how you define it, because evangelical is one of those terms that people don't know how to define in the modern world. But around 60 to 75% of them are Republican. And about 25 to 30% are Democrat, and the rest are independent, something along those lines. This is a rough estimate from the top of my head, from what I remember. The point is that there's actually more political diversity even amongst evangelical Christians than there are amongst atheists. And yet, the atheists keep insisting that it's the other way around. There's political diversity in atheism and none at all in religion, or at least very little. And they even explain the diversity in religion by saying some people are less religious and are more secular, religious moderates. And that's not the real world that we look at and that we live in. And the reason for this is because even though atheism is formally defined, they got dictionaries to go along with them in universities too, and even all the AI say it, atheism is by definition just a lack of belief in a God. When you're dealing with real people and not dictionary definitions of terms, you find that the people who by definition just lack belief, and will tell you that, believe there is no God, or at least they say they believe there is no God. And remember, there's complex layers of human psychology. I think ultimately they believe there's a God, but their conscious persona that they develop is one that doesn't, and they actually tell themselves that and kind of convince themselves of it. But they're living in a materialist world where no gods exist, at least mentally. I'm not saying that's the real world, atheist. I'm talking about psychology. I have to be careful because atheists always like twisting my words. I recently got into a discussion with an atheist trying to explain concepts about God as the ultimate creator of everything else. And I actually said that if God didn't create, then nothing would exist. And that atheist turned that on me by saying, "Oh, you're saying God created himself. Either that or God doesn't exist. Because if God created everything, that would mean God has to create himself." And there's no leeway with these people. Then that wasn't some isolated incident. That happens routinely. I have to be overly specific when I talk on these videos. But having said that, the modern day atheist movement is not people who just lack belief in a God. They're people who claim that God doesn't exist and that we live in a natural materialist world. Atheism is a belief, and like with all beliefs, has to connect to other beliefs in your mind. And this is because human minds are analog. We can't just take an idea in, hold it in our thoughts, but not connect it to anything else. We're not computers. We can't just ignore that data and go with other data as if it doesn't exist. The idea of God has been introduced to every atheist that talks about how evil religion is. That's why I really don't believe that they lack belief. That's another reason. Because even if we were all born atheists, because we were all born lacking belief in a God, the fact that atheists are talking about God means that the idea of God has been introduced to them at some point. And you have to do something with that idea. Now, keep in mind, I've had plenty of atheists point out how wrong I am for what I'm about to say by pointing out that, according to what I'm about to say, I must believe in leprechauns and the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. Because I'm about to say something that is ridiculous and absurd on its face, but that's the obvious meaning. Of course, being a typical religious person, I haven't thought about the implication. But this is the implication. And of course, I'm going to admit the atheist is right that I lack belief in these things. Of course, I'm not going to admit that, and they're missing the point entirely. You see, my point is that atheism is a belief that no gods exist. Atheism is not a lack of belief in a god. Meaning, I am actually saying it is possible to reject something. It is possible to believe that something is false. But for some reason, every time I bring this up, atheists think I'm saying, you must believe something is true, because the idea is introduced. But I'll explain it anyway. The human mind is analog. Every idea that it is exposed to, either by direct experience or by being told about the idea, enters the mind, is processed in terms of what it means, and then connected to other ideas in your mind. The reason that the human mind does this is so that it can assess the information and use it more rapidly in connection with other information in a real world. This is why computers are not and probably cannot ever be truly intelligent. That's why the current model of artificial intelligence that we're using isn't really artificial intelligence. The large language models can mimic intelligence, but they're really just pattern seekers on a digital code. The human mind is reactive to the world around it in a way that digital systems simply aren't. And that's the point that's being made. Once an idea is introduced, you cannot just lack belief in the idea. You can't have an idea introduced to you and just have it in your mind but not do anything with it. You have to connect it to everything else to determine its importance, the likelihood of it occurring in your life, and what it means to you, what it means to how you live. Everything that you have ever been exposed to, no matter how minor it would be, fits into that web somehow. That means it is literally impossible to just lack belief in something once the idea has been introduced to you. It's at this point that the atheists start mocking my ideas and pointing out leprechauns and unicorns and tell me that I must believe these things are real. I have to believe in fairies. After all, I just said you can't lack belief in them. And the attempt is to shame me into admitting that or committing the special pleading fallacy by saying, no, you're wrong. I do lack belief in leprechauns. I do lack belief in fairies. I do lack belief in whatever other in Santa Claus. But it's different with them because it's different with them between God because. And I don't have that. That's not what I'm saying. You see, just because I said you can't lack belief in something once the idea is introduced doesn't mean I'm saying you can't believe the claim is false. So As far as their point is concerned, I would never say I lack belief in leprechauns and fairies and Santa Claus, but that doesn't mean I believe in them. You can believe leprechauns do not exist. You can believe fairies do not exist. You can believe Santa Claus does not exist. You cannot lack belief in leprechauns, fairies, and Santa Claus, but you can believe they do not exist. And of course, it's a little more complicated with me because I actually don't think the way they think I do. For instance, I know Santa Claus does exist. Santa Claus is a corruption of St. Nicholas, and St. Nicholas was a saint from Asia Minor. So, he actually does exist. But for the sake of argument, I'm accepting their premise that these are obviously non-existent things and I lack belief in them. Well, I don't lack belief in them. Even accepting their premise that I just don't accept that they're real, that doesn't mean I lack belief. It means that I believe they're false. It means that I believe leprechauns don't exist. It means I believe fairies don't exist. It means I believe Santa Claus does not exist. And that's the point that they're ignoring. Atheism is a belief that God does not exist. Atheism is not a lack of belief in a God. And it never has been. And you can't really get them to understand that. At the same time, the belief that God doesn't exist cannot exist on its own. It must inevitably connect to other beliefs. And that is why atheists are overwhelmingly progressive. Because the modern day atheist movement is not modern. It didn't start with Sam Harris and the New Atheism in the early 2000s. Every argument the New Atheists made were pulled from historical atheists and ultimately came from humanist literature. That's why the overwhelming majority of the New Atheists in the New Atheist movement started espousing humanist doctrines. And when you look at every single writer in the New Atheism, they were all members of various humanist organizations. Richard Dawkins was a member, and still is, a member of the British Humanist Association. I think it changed its name, and I can't remember its new name, but it doesn't matter. We're talking historically. Sam Harris is a member of the American Humanist Association and a few other humanist groups. Christopher Hitchens was a member of the American Humanist Association and the Council for Secular Humanism, which later became the Center for Inquiry. It merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation to become the Center of Inquiry specifically. They were all members of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. They were all members of American Atheist, except Dawkins, who was British. Well, I don't know. Dawkins may have been a member of that, but I don't think he was. But Dawkins is a member of the National Secular Society. And all of these atheist organizations aren't just atomized individual organizations. They all form networks of other free thinkers and rationalists. So even if you're a member of just one of them, you'll still have connections to the others. And then, of course, there's atheist literature. And we know the atheists were using that atheist literature because not only were their arguments the same, and they used similar terminology that sounded original and intellectual, was actually them quoting from 19th century sources. A good example of that would be how an entire chapter in God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything by Christopher Hitchens was plagiarized from Chapman Cohen. They really just revised these old arguments and did a little revising of them to update them, and added that idea that communism was actually a form of religion, that communists didn't kill in the name of atheism garbage that they added. But that's the point. If you trace the evolution of atheist ideas, you see that the modern day atheist movement goes back to the 19th century free thought movement, which in turn was drawing from Hegelian philosophy. And Hegel was a Lutheran. He was not an atheist. But his philosophical system was deeply influential. But certain people who loved Hegel's analytics and the foundation of his philosophical understanding decided to reject Hegel's theological models. And they created a materialist version of Hegelian philosophy. And that materialist version of Hegelian philosophy became known as Neo-Hegelianism. And it is from there that we get the modern day trend in atheist thought. Starting largely with Ludwig Feuerbach, who is largely seen as the father of the modern atheist philosophies of Neo-Hegelianism. But Feuerbach also inspired Karl Marx, and Feuerbach and Marx both inspired Sigmund Freud. And they both inspired Auguste Comte and others like them. So it's kind of ironic that the atheist movement that insists that it has no connection to Christianity and didn't grow out of Christianity actually grew directly out of a Lutheran theologian's work. But that is life. But that's where you get the idea of a dialectic materialism. And I know they don't use the term dialectic materialism anymore. They just say they're materialist. But if you listen to their arguments, they're obviously laboring under the 19th century concept of a dialectic materialism. A materialism that says that everything that exists is matter in motion in contrast to other matter in motion, and that all of the things we see occur happen as a result of one form of matter exerting an influence on another, causing a contradictive state that has to be resolved. But once the resolution happens, new contradictions are created, which creates a perpetual cycle. That is the Hegelian dialectic, as understood by the Neo-Hegelians, and that is still the underpinning of modern-day atheist thinking. That's why they deny that we have free will, for instance. Which, of course, they frame as an anti-religion argument, because they'll say, religion teaches you have free will. Which is absurd, because when they talk about religion, they're just talking about Christianity, and there are several Protestant groups that don't believe in free will, such as Calvinists famously, but also Lutherans, which Hegel was a Lutheran, oddly enough. But that's the point. And early on, the atheist movement embraced the reformist movements of the early 19th century. That's not to say that the reformist movements were all inherently atheistic. Even today, progressivism isn't inherently atheistic. What's more, not every atheist who is a progressive is necessarily a militant atheist. But there's significant overlap between progressivism and atheism, precisely because a lot of progressive thought also came out of the Hegelian dialectic, which understood the creation as an ongoing process of God, as he created a universe so that he could understand himself, and in contrast to the universe, God can see himself through it until a final synthesis is reached, which is union with God. The Neo-Hegelians, of course, reject God and see the universe as a self-existing, self-perpetuating mechanism based on juxtaposed natural forces, which sees an evolutionary chain of progress begin at first through material means in contrast to each other, forming resolution through synthesis, which creates new contradictions, which creates new resolutions later on, which eventually led somehow to the formation of life, which then later developed through evolution into its present state, and then we go through social evolution, which will always supersede previous orders, which are flawed and undermined, and that ultimately produce new social orders to fix those problems that eventually create new social conditions, which create new social order. So that an old social order will create a new social order by the contradictions that it created, that force a progress upward. And that is where the entire progressive ideology came from. That is also where the modern atheist movement came from. And it traces back to that moment. But too many people don't know that history and don't know the actual philosophical depth to it. I'm not giving the philosophical depth in this video. It's already a very long video, but I don't have time to cover that in detail. I might later in some other video. But the point being made is, the modern atheist movement, the new atheism from 20 years ago, was an astroturf movement. It was bought and paid for by wealthy donors like George Soros and by the Edge Foundation. And one of the things that people don't seem to realize, though it's easy to check this, all four of the four horsemen of the new atheism actually had the same literary agent, John Brockman. And the reason the new atheism came into existence was to act as a counter to the rise of the religious right in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And they sought to dislodge the power of the religious right by having a secular left. And they brought in all of these progressive ideas that are not well thought out. They're largely warmed over Marxism, social Darwinism, and neo-Hegelianism, but largely stripped of the underlying philosophical understanding that used to exist in them, reduced to very surface-level concepts that are then repurposed to fit onto current trends and new ideas that they were never meant to be imposed upon, which caused a permutation in them. Which inevitably, of course, led to schisms within the atheist movement, schisms within progressive movement, but it also led to the insanity we see in the progressive movement. Because it is largely predicated on simplistic, surface-level understanding of a handful of ideas, repurposed to serve what is ultimately hedonism. Where, in the modern world, the progressive ideology, even amongst progressives who profess to be religious, even those who profess to be Christians, have this understanding of progressivism as being about human liberation and about freedom being this inviolable good, but freedom also being understood in a very limited way, based upon an idea of an oppressed minority classes that always had to rise up to fight the overclass. And in this case, they make the underclass race, sex, religion in case of Muslim, and of course sexual identity. At first it was mainly just gay rights, and now it's also transgenderism. And even though people talk about the slippery slope fallacy years ago, it's not really a slippery slope fallacy if you point to the fact that belief A must inevitably lead to point B, must inevitably lead to point C, must inevitably lead to point D. And that is what we got. If you have decided that we are nothing but base material beings, and if you have decided that we are all ultimately equal and interchangeable, and if you have decided there is no fundamental fixed reality, no fundamental fixed nature, and that we can be something internally that we're not externally, and we should be able to change our externals to match our internal reality, then you are ultimately putting the internal life of the mind above the material world, which the 19th century materialists would have never done. And the modern ones have this bizarre schizophrenic view of. They will profess a materialist view of the world, where the base facts of our existence are not contingent on our thoughts and our feelings. But then they will demand that their thoughts and their feelings about their identity and what they want to do take precedent over everything else, and that the material reality must reshape itself around them. Although they never phrase it that way, they always pretend the material reality supports them. It's like the material reality has become God. And like with some Christians who don't truly try and understand how God was understood historically, and just use God as a comfort and a way to justify what they want. They're using materialism as a way of justifying themselves by saying, science proves this. And of course, largely the scientific establishment goes along with it. That's how we got the transgender movement. Transgenderism is an insanity that has gripped the Western world, where we actually pretend that we cannot tell what sex someone is when they're born. A doctor will assign you a gender at birth, but that might be the wrong gender, and you might actually be the opposite gender. And we know what gender you are by you finally thinking and discovering in some internal way and being honest about your true inner self. And of course, that's not reality. People who are born men are men. People who are born women are women. You are not assigned a sex at birth. You are that sex. And while you're able to use your mind and fantasize about being the opposite sex, as a writer, I've done that a lot because I have to write characters that are the opposite sex, and I'll imagine being that character, but that's another matter. You can imagine being that other sex. But that doesn't mean you are that other sex, no matter how much you cling to the idea that you are. And that's what ultimately makes the modern world insane. You can encapsulate it around transgenderism. There's more to it than just transgenderism, but transgenderism is one of the most obvious examples. Because transgender people are not people who were born with the wrong body. They're not people who were assigned the wrong sex at birth. They're not people who really are the opposite sex. A transgender woman is a man who is delusional and thinks he's a woman. And a transgender woman, and a transgender man is a woman who is delusional and thinks she's a man. I'm not being cruel and lacking in compassion and empathy by saying that. It's just a fact. And ultimately, these facts are never going to change based on what you want them to be. They can't. Facts are facts are facts are facts are facts are facts. But the very people who will tell us that facts don't care about your feelings, almost like Ben Shapiro, only in a more progressive tone, and will say, I believe in science and reason and evidence and critical thinking, will then make the evidence that they are transgender about how they feel. And ultimately, how they feel doesn't change the reality. Even the transgender surgery, if they get it, does nothing but sterilize them and create a simulacrum of being the opposite sex. A man cannot be a woman, and a woman cannot be a man. Perhaps one day we will have technology that can actually change us, but if I were to find a transgender woman and took a DNA sample, that DNA sample will return that transgender woman is a man. If I find a transgender man and take a DNA sample, that sample will say that transgender man is a woman. The bone structure will still be that of a man or a woman. If it's a transgender woman, the bone structure is a man. If it is a transgender man, the bone structure is a woman. It is irrelevant what they say they are. And ultimately, to be a transgender, let's say I'm a transgender, I'm actually a woman. I was assigned male as my gender at birth, but I became a woman and I go through the surgery. And now I look like a woman. Well, in order to maintain that, I have to be on estrogen for the rest of my life. I have to go through constant hormone replacement. And of course, I have to do other things to my body on a regular basis, like stick something up my makeshift lady parts in order to prevent them from sealing closed because my body is treating it like a wound. I am going to have to go through lifelong medical care in order to maintain my truth. Because it's not true. I'm having to take drugs and hormone replacements and go through all of the physical necessities that I can't really talk about freely on this platform. Because nature will not allow me as a man to be a woman, and it is irrelevant how I feel or what I want. I am just making myself a lifelong medical patient while preventing myself from ever having children, or at least biological children. That's all transgenderism is. And keep in mind, I know that some people can't have children, and I understand that I don't have any children. I didn't get lucky enough to have any. But I didn't take actions to deliberately change myself in such a way that I couldn't have them. And even men that are in accidents and therefore lose their fertility, or women who are in accidents or have some sort of disease, or perhaps that are born with some sort of defect, it's not their fault, and we shouldn't blame them. We treat them as equals. But they're still exactly what they are. A man or a woman. And one thing that the traditional religions of the world have taught us is that we need to learn acceptance. We don't seem to know that in the West. It's especially popular to teach that in Buddhism or Taoism, that you should learn acceptance. Acceptance of what you are, acceptance of the reality around you. And that one of the causes of distress and unhappiness is the inability to accept things. And the Bible and the Christian tradition teach much the same thing. I've never really believed in this idea that every religion has to be in direct competition all the time. I think that quite often religions, the world's religious traditions, are about beliefs about the real world. And that while there are specific differences or specific things in each religion that we can talk about that aren't present in others, quite often the teachings overlap to a greater degree than people today would realize. And I don't really think that being a Christian means I must reject all other religions as simply false. There can be true things in those religions. And I think there are. And that's ultimately the point. Because I honestly think that the modern secularist ideas that we have, where we give up religion and embrace reason and science, are themselves a form of religion, and are in fact the same type of religion that they condemn. They are irrational. They're based on belief without evidence in abstract ideas. They put their emotions above everything else. And ultimately, you can understand what people will do based upon predicting their religion. For instance, why is it that in the modern world there's such push for slide? And if you didn't understand what I'm saying, just think of death with dignity, or dignity and dying. Believe it or not, the phrase death with dignity comes from the humanist tradition and is found in the Second Humanist Manifesto of 1973 and is declared as a human right that they're promoting. Even though the modern world won't admit this because they realize it would give the game away, the simple reality is the new atheism was successful in getting people to reject religion and embrace reason, insofar as we accept reason as accepting humanist principles. They just don't call them that and don't admit what they are and claim that they're secular. They're not religious. They're just looking at the evidence and going where it leads, when in reality they're just embracing humanism. And that's why the governments are doing what they're doing. That's why in Canada, In Quebec, they're debating creating a law that forbids public prayer. And yes, atheists, I know, Jesus himself said we shouldn't pray in public! Christians are hypocrites for doing so anyway! In reality, public prayer was a part of Jewish daily life, and it was part of temple worship. Jesus didn't actually condemn public prayer. He condemned praying like the Pharisees did when they stood in public to be seen of men for how pious they were. Public prayer wasn't what was condemned by Jesus. Praying for show was. And ultimately, it doesn't even matter. Because Jesus didn't say the Pharisees should be put in jail for public prayer. And in Quebec, they're saying that it's a secular state. They should be secular. And public prayer is an affront to secularism. Oh, you'll still have freedom of religion, but keep your prayers in your churches or your mosques or your synagogues or in your homes. Don't pray in public. It's an affront to secular values. And we all go along with it as if secular values means not religious. Really what they're saying is it's an affront to their religious values. Their religion is secularism. That's why we're promoting death with dignity. It's not really about giving dignity to people that are about to pass on. Death with dignity is a humanist idea, and they're trying to rewrite our laws, our culture, and our custom to conform with humanism. They're imposing a religion on us. That's all it amounts to, an imposed religion. And humanism is a religion based on false premises that will always lead to madness, like dyeing your hair blue, thinking you're the opposite gender than you are, thinking that you should have everything you want given to you. And if you don't get it, well, you're having your rights denied. It's about surrendering personal responsibility to a communal group. And that's why it promotes things like a woman's reproductive freedom. Euphemism. And why it promotes death with dignity. Which I may as well say euphemism on, because that's what it is. Bizarrely, people in the secularist community think Christianity is a religion of death that worships dead guy on a stick, ignoring the resurrection. But they promote, and then they talk about how life-affirming they are as secularists. But they promote death. The death of babies, the death of the elderly or the disabled. And it's no different than the eugenics movement in the late 19th or early 20th century, which incidentally was also promoted by secularists. Look it up. Joseph McCabe, Charles Bradlaugh, Anne Besant, Carl Pearson, George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells. They all promoted eugenics. Basically, all of the prominent atheist writers were promoting eugenics. Regardless of the claims now that they weren't, and weirdly, they're now promoting a new form of eugenics. This is why Yuval Noah Harari is being promoted as some great philosopher now. He promotes the same basic message of the new atheism, but there's really no difference. But having said all of that, humanism causes madness because it cuts us off from the source of all life, God. And it tells us that God does not exist, and we live in a dead, material, inert universe, and that we are nothing but matter being reshaped by natural forces, and that we can reshape that world as we want through the power of science and reason. We try and put our will above nature, and we cut ourselves off from nature, and we cut ourselves off from God. We say we don't. We say we're naturalists. We say we believe in nature. At least in the 19th century, they were honest about a desire to conquer nature and bend it to our will. Now they claim to be environmentalists who respect nature, but they're still trying to bend nature to their will. That is the nature of humanism. And they can doll it up by saying that it's not this, but it is. They are trying to conform nature to their own will, to give themselves their own hedonistic desires, and ultimately they're turning inward. They're not growing outward, they're turning inward, and that means they must contract. Because if you don't turn outward and look outward, if you don't grow, you will contract. And humanism always leads to a contraction. It promises progress. It promises advancement. It promises to look outward, but it always turns inward to your own desires. It is humanism's fatal flaw. And it will always lead to death in the end, and authoritarianism and control. And that is why we see the madness of the modern world. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.